guys recognize the picture? You guys have to recognize the picture. This is funny, but this is not as funny as what the next one is. In fact, I'll go ahead and show it to you. We're going to have the daily quiz, but you should see it because it's kind of funny to me. Okay, there we go. And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. Don't they're foreign children, so it didn't really matter.
This is not funny, it's offensive.
Oh, it's totally funny. Why? What's the argument? Who is this? You're right. Totally Dr. Seuss. 1940s. I don't know that. Yeah, it does. It actually said Dr. Seuss. 1940s. What's he arguing?
America matters the most.
Yeah, well, is he actually arguing that?
I'm just going by the picture that said America first.
Yeah, I know, but you look at this and you say it's foreign children. It didn't matter. Is this something that you're supposed to believe?
He's being sarcastic.
Totally sarcastic. Like, that's a horrible thing. All children matter, foreign or not. So what's he arguing?
He's arguing that Hitler is so bad and he's chewing up children.
And so what should the United States do?
Nothing.
No!
Because they're foreign.
That's
just kidding.
Go ahead.
I'm saying that we need to get involved.
We absolutely need to get involved. He absolutely be involved. But he is making fun of who? That's why it's got America first. Who is he making fun of? Isolationists. Yeah. He's making fun of the people saying, no, we don't get outside. We don't worry about it. We're only dealing with what the United States is. He's making fun of those people. And he said, well, they're foreign children. Anyone who watches that knows that that's the exact opposite of what he really means. Okay, now this is kind of a very interesting thing. Does the United States want to get involved in World War II? Yes, the president certainly does, but what about the people? People don't, and this is really a big deal. This is understanding isolationism, and I'm going to tell you, it's a complex, my very first book was on isolationism, and it's a complex argument. Your textbooks, I'll just be flat honest, mostly get it wrong. And it's not because they're stupid, they're very smart, and all the people are very smart, but as with all of these cases, the textbooks have a small amount of space, and the concept is big. And they just don't have enough time to kind of explain the subtleties. I get to explain subtleties to you, right? And you can handle this. Prior to World War I, the United States had isolationism as a policy. What is the difference between isolationism as a policy and isolationism as a social movement? This is why your textbooks don't put this in. It's hard. Go ahead, Mary.
Isolation as a policy, is that because the country cannot function or succeed if it's not isolated, and then as a social movement, because people don't want to?
Okay, you're totally on the ball. Let me put the language into that, because what you said was right. Prior to World War I, our policy was diplomatic isolationism. We don't get involved with treaties, entangling alliances. This is what George Washington said, entangling alliances, said way back with his farewell address. And that was basically our policy right up until World War I. No entangling alliances. So we didn't have treaties with France or England or any of these guys. We had some treaties that defined the borders way back late 1700s, early 1800s, but there's no treaties in terms of military. No entangling alliances. We were never economic isolationists. We tried that for a little bit in 1808, 1809, and it was an utter failure. So we loved trading with everybody. And we were never cultural isolationists. We didn't prevent people from coming into the United States or leaving the United States. But in terms of diplomacy, we followed a policy of isolationism. We don't get involved. This is one of the reasons why we don't get involved with World War I in 1914. That it's Europe, and Europe is, in our minds, a little corrupt. We eventually get involved with World War I because we have no choice. This is really critical. We didn't want to get involved with World War I, but we could not be as big and strong as we were and not be affected by a war that's dominating Europe. And so our ships, unrestricted submarine warfare, we got involved with World War I. This is a lesson that taught us something. If we can't get involved with World War I, is it possible for us to be completely immune to World War II? Is it really possible for us to be completely immune to a massive war of any name in Europe? No. And so in terms of policy, we were no longer isolationists. Now this is where it's confusing. And part of this, it has to do with how your textbook starts explaining our approach to World War I, how they start explaining what we do afterwards, how they start explaining the UN and all sorts of stuff. And they find themselves kind of in a difficult situation because they don't carry the narrative from the beginning to the end. But the fact is, when the war is over, World War I, we do not join the League of Nations. We're not in it. We do not join. Now, does that mean that we are isolationists? No. Why not?
Because we just didn't agree with the thing.
We thought the League was corrupt. We thought the treaty was overly harsh. We thought that it promoted winners and losers. And our whole argument was that there were no winners. There should be no losers. Germany isn't really any more at fault than England. And so it's not reasonable for them to accept all the blame and then pay through the nose for a long time because it's going to make things worse. Wilson was okay with this as long as we got the League. That was his baby. He wanted the League. He comes back to the United States and Congress rejects it not once, but twice. The American people were very opposed to us joining the League of Nations. And it wasn't just because of this isolationist heritage. It was on the idea that it's corrupt. It's a tool used by the English and the French to maintain their empires and to keep Germany down. And that's just going to lead to more wars. So we're not going to be a part of it. But we're not isolationists. What's the proof of this? Proof number one, the Washington Naval Treaties. What was this? I talked about this in the 20s. I don't know if you remember. It was arms reduction. Now, you guys unfortunately don't remember, but in the Cold War, this was a really big deal between the Soviet Union and the United States. Arms limitation talks, arms reduction talks. Well, we don't have nuclear weapons in World War I, but what do we have? What's the big, powerful tool that people have? Ships. Ships. So this was a way of controlling the massive artillery. So we set ratios. And the people that were in there, we had England, we had France, we had Russia, we have Japan, and we have the U.S., and we set ratios. The U.S. gets to have like 7. England gets 7. 5, 5, I don't remember, I think Russia was at 5. Bunch of ratios. So that if we added more weapons, that would allow them to add more weapons. It's an arms reduction. This is a treaty. This is not no entangling alliances. This is a treaty. And the United States is doing it, but we're not doing it through the League. It's like a parallel system. Another example, and we were making fun of this quite often, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Who is this really initially between? Kellogg is America. Who's Briand? French, right? Originally, it's between us, and it's basically a law to outlaw war. And then I believe, and I could be wrong on the number, but something like 162 nations signed on this. Is this example of isolationism? No. But it's not through the League. Now, your textbook, it's hard to explain this. It's hard to explain it. They just don't have enough space to explain it thoroughly. And so they generally say, well, the United States was isolationist. We went into World War I, we were upset about it, and then we went back into isolationism. And it's not true. In terms of our foreign policy, we became anti-isolationist. We were involved, but we weren't doing it through the League. You might call it unilateralism. And this is a wonderful word that nobody likes anymore. Unilateralism. Does anybody have an idea, just looking at what it means, the word unilateralism?
One-sided.
It's what it is. It's, I mean, quite literally what it means. One-sided. The United States will enter in whatever agreement that we think is most useful for our country's interests. We're not going to get into the League of Nations because we think it's corrupt. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a member there watching what's going on. And it doesn't mean that we're not interested. We are. And we may sometimes comment on their decisions. But we will have other agreements that we do outside of the League of Nations. So the United States, by policy, is not isolationist. Go ahead.
Question, how big of a role did Article 10 play in our staying out of the League?
I can't remember Article 10.
Okay.
Is this the military,
That
use
was
of
the
military?
one for all and all for one.
Yeah, that's the, we were torn on that a little bit because the United States didn't want to have military access. That was the whole point of the Kellogg Beyond. On the other hand, there's a lot of really reasonable people that said if you have no military, then you don't really have a league. And I would say that was probably its greatest weakness. When we get back into the UN, we don't have this weakness. The very first thing we do is to make sure that we're going to have a military commitment. So if someone breaks the law, it's not just going to be an economic sanction. What is an economic sanction? It's like we boycott them. We don't let them trade with us. And that's kind of what we were hoping for with the League of Nations. What happens when Italy invades North Africa? 36. Nothing. The League of Nations says you can't do that, but people debated whether or not we should apply economic sanctions. Because if we apply economic sanctions, we may be actually encouraging some type of hostility. They debated it. Same thing when Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. Japan is in the League of Nations. They signed on the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The League said, no, you've just violated the rule. You can't do that. What does Japan say? Well, I guess we're not in the League of Nations anymore. That's it. It has no authority, no power to it. And oddly enough, the United States was not involved. And so we were quite critical of this component.